So with Games Workshop's usual balance passes, we might expect a balanced Dataslate within the next 3 weeks. Let's talk about some of the factions that most need help, some that might well be heading for nerfs, and some wish lists and ideas for some in the middle. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about Games Workshop's next balance update and possibilities for what it could bring. 40K's normal balance dataslates and big rules updates tend to happen around about quarterly, typically with changes to points and rules for the majority of factions each time. The last one was the one that introduced the 2025 to 2026 mission deck. It did have a bunch of changes for plenty of factions, though maybe the things that have had bigger impacts, at least at the top end of the meta recently, have been the Codex releases, particularly Codex Death Guard, which didn't get any sort of changes in the last one, and the Chaos Knights book, along with the Imperial Knight changes that happened after, with their new profiles and massive points cuts. As they usually tend to do these around about 3 monthly though, there's a pretty good chance that we could expect the next one in early September. The last one came out on the 4th of June, so there's a pretty good chance we could expect the next one sometime around early September. It usually tends to drop on a Wednesday. I guess maybe the 3rd of September could be a likely date, could be a week before or the week after or something. It seems at this point it's pretty unlikely they're going to do any sort of extra emergency balance patch, which they've sometimes done in the past. It feels like armies like Death Guard and Knights do kind of warrant it at the moment, but they haven't got round to it. It was kind of weird that the follow-up one that they did addressed a bunch of other things, making changes to World Eaters summoning demons and nerfing the Thousand Suns Warp Meld pact for some reason, though leaving Death Guard and the Knights well intact. As per usual, the balance updates most likely to contain points updates, rules changes via the balanced dataslate, and then I guess 3 new detachments for factions that haven't had a bonus one yet, done in a similar sort of style to the Grotmas ones, with some new content and different ways to play their armies. I still say at the moment that game balance in Warhammer 40k is at least fairly good for the majority of factions in the midfield. There's 28 factions in the game and the vast majority of them can have a pretty good chance of beating each other with a good list played well, player scale and list construction certainly being more important than army choice, but that being said, I do feel like at the moment, compared with the last year or so of Warhammer 40k, there's a few more obvious problem ones. As usual, some factions just seeming to do worse than the rest, so at the moment it feels like the more obvious problems are the factions doing well. In particular, Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights and Death Guard are rather running rampant. For this one though, I thought we could round up a bunch of potential balanced dataslate changes that might be nice, necessary, or maybe more likely things for Games Workshop to look at, starting with a few of the factions that seem to be having less success at the moment, then some of the strongest stuff, and then talking about a whole bunch of things in the middle, and other nice internal balance options they could do with a balance pass. Starting out, let's talk about a few of the armies that seem to be at the lower end of the performance stats, and first up we have the Orks. It seems that for tournament win rates out of the factions that Games Workshop actually seems to be trying to balance somewhat, they might be having the worst of it right now. Win rates are around about 43%, certainly struggling for the average player, and that does seem to be the case for both casual and competitive data. They have still had some grand tournament wins, so not unplayable with an optimised list played really well. But even that isn't necessarily that impressive given they're quite a popular faction with lots of people tending to put them on the table, though less than usual at the moment. The last update did feel a bit painful for the Greenskins. It maybe wasn't too surprising to see them drop after this. Games Workshop finally threw a bone to the Cult of Speed. The bug is Deathcopters and Squighog Boys all got cheaper and the Cult of Speed detachment got buffed, but it was also done alongside some nerfs to some fairly core units and a bunch of detachments, the Shock Attack Gun Mech, Looters, big flash kits units, big boys mobs, and then absolute staples that a whole load of detachments use with the truck and the tank busters. It just seemed a bit disproportionate to me, given that they were already not doing super well for the average player, even if people haven't been managing to win some grand tournaments with Warhorde. The changes do seem to have made people double down on that build though, generally Warhorde with transports and scary melee stuff jumping out of them, maybe some tank busters and then the usual objective support. I saw someone won a tournament with Cult of Speed, which was quite fun, with maxed out Deathcopters and some war bikes, but it doesn't really seem to have taken off in a big way since the changes, and certainly doesn't look like the buggies are in any way fixed, given in that list there were barely any. At the moment they do feel like one of the most obvious armies that just could do with a fairly solid buff and getting back into the mid-tier of factions. Maybe a whole bunch of small points cuts to units that are already fairly efficient. A bunch of 5-point drops could maybe allow you an extra unit or so, and make the army a bit more fun. There's certainly a whole bunch of things in the Orc army that are still really quite overshadowed. The buggies don't seem to be particularly efficient despite their points drops. I feel like just given the size of the models, they could probably do more with rules buffs as opposed to further points cuts if anything. Most of the Orc walkers are in a fairly similar position, not generally doing particularly well even with the fairly enormous buffs that Dread Mob can bring, and if they often get overlooked in strong lists even there then something is wrong. I do wonder if the strength of the Orc detachments might be creating some problems. given that they do seem to just add a lot of value to certain unit types, particularly say Dread Mob buffing or the mech related stuff and making it very scary. But on the other hand, a bunch of stuff isn't particularly efficient even there, so there certainly feels like there's room for points cuts. Maybe as a bonus wishlist item, it'd be quite nice to have more Dakka actually being a fair bit more usable, somewhere between the pretty broken version of it when they had it at release, and then providing no damage buffs on normal turns most of the time. I can't help but imagine there's some sort of happy medium where the Orks on foot could shoot harder in that detachment, but without breaking mass to the extent where they literally double their firepower. In any case, fingers crossed that Games Workshop show the greenskins some love at the next update. Next up, and also seeming to be struggling for the average player at the moment, are the Space Marines. It looks like their tournament win rates are around about 44%, and again that seems to be the same for both competitive and more casual datasets. There still do seem to be an army that can compete at the absolute highest level, usually with Ultramarines armies played very well. They have had 4 grand tournament wins since the balance pass, but that's not actually an impressive number for the sheer amount of people playing them. The last update did give them a bunch of small points cuts, cheaper Hellblasters, Aggressors, Vanguard Veterans, Heavy Intercessors, and the Jump Captain, and then some changes to the Ultramarines, with a bit of break in the Ultramarine synergy, where it's less rewarding to have both Calgar and Guilliman on the table, and Guilliman's free stratagems being reined in. It still didn't seem to be particularly likely to change up Ultramarines and Gladius Task Force as the order of the day though. That still seems to be the vast majority of what people are taking when they try and play a strong Space Marine list. They do genuinely have other builds that work. Firestorm, Ironstorm, Vanguard and Stormlance all have some good draws. Stormlance maybe seeming to do a bit better at top-end competitive style things. Firestorm maybe being a bit more popular on the casual scene. For potential balance updates, I guess the new batch of Space Marine characters has the potential to add a little bit more strength and potentially some draw away from Ultramarines. Hopefully Games Workshop managed to make some of those characters interesting and powerful. As we've seen from the Salamanders and their Forge Fathers detachment, it looks like they're going to be doing some slightly rewritten detachments alongside those characters. The Firestorm one did lose a good enhancement, but gained fallback and shoot, which is quite nice for a close range shooting force to be able to do. It could be nice to have the opportunity to take a fresh look at those, and maybe make some tweaks where it makes sense, or the detachment rules weren't working enormously well. I feel like out of the core ones that are likely to get rewrites, maybe the Anvil Siege Force is the one that could most use a bit of attention. It's not really worked so well after the Space Marine Codex came out, and didn't really get much more unique stuff when its +1 to wound thing was overshadowed by Oath and Moment. Otherwise though, it feels like Space Marines in general could do with an overall power boost. Their standard Terminator squad hasn't really stacked up well in 10th edition so far, and could probably do with a more drastic points cuts to make it more tempting. There's plenty of other things that kind of underwhelm at the moment that could be brought more to the fore. Maybe things like Firestrike turrets, the Dreadnought, Eliminators, Devastator squads, the Gladiator Valiant, regular Tactical Marines, the Land Raider Crusader, and the Stormspeeder Hailstrike. Most of those are very rare to see in competitive lists at the moment, never mind if they actually decided to help out some of the stuff that's already alright. Aside from the chapter-specific detachment, it could be quite good to see some help for the First Company Task Force as well. A detachment with really quite a fun theme revolving around the Terminators and friends, but has had bad rules since the Codex came out. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to Titan's Terrain, the video sponsor. They have one option to get a battlefield worth of Warhammer 40k terrain on the go. They do things a little bit differently to most options out there with their system of folding cardboard pop-up terrain. The idea is that you basically have a 3x4 grid that makes up a 12 tile board that makes up 45 by 60 inches, the right size for Warhammer 40k. Each one of those tiles unfolds and then up pops a building. So you can basically have an entire ruined city or a chaos factory or something like that, and basically have a 3D battlefield that you can store completely flat, and it transports around in a box the same size as maybe a standard board game. Otherwise, it's significantly cheaper than Games Workshop's offerings for a battlefield worth of terrain, maybe kind of similar to MDF prices, and doesn't require any hobby work at all to get it on the board. It's ready to go straight out of the box set, which could be handy for people who are limited on time or prefer to save it for their miniatures. There are certainly some pros and cons versus other sets out there. I'll talk through a few of those and some of their specific offerings at the end of the video if you'd like to stick around for that. Check them out, links down in the video description though if you'd like to, and thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, at the bottom end of 40k's power spectrum, it's always worth mentioning the Imperial Agents. They do have a codex, and at any point Games Workshop could decide to support them as a more mainline faction. At the moment they seem like they're not. Tournament data in any given balance pass rotation just doesn't really mean much as there's so few people playing them as a faction. It looks like they win around about 40% of their games casually, quite a bit lower than the vast majority of factions out there. They didn't really get any proper sort of help in the last balance update. They did get a small quality of life boost to their Imperialis fleet detachment, which does tend to be their best one, allowing characters to attach when they're deep striking or infiltrating, as with the detachment's enhancements. That was genuinely useful, though I'm not sure it was necessarily aimed to be a balance buff as opposed to just having FAQs about that and Games Workshop deciding that to be the way that things happen now. At the moment, they're not really played on a competitive level to any great extent, but when they do so, it tends to be board control things brought by the Imperialis fleet. Lots of subductors, navy breachers, maybe Kyria Draxus and some assassins, and potentially an allied knight like Canis Rex to do a bit of heavy lifting and making the army have some teeth. Their main faction problems are the same ones they had at launch. They don't really have any efficient way to handle monsters and vehicles, so if Games Workshop just keep on decreasing points cost, they just become a bit of a board control spam kind of army, able to grind out wins by move blocking and scoring victory points, but not the most enjoyable way to play Warhammer 40k. They don't have a core faction rule outside of their allied one, which would be a good way to add something that could help out with monsters and vehicles, maybe some more lethal hits generosity, or some rules for orbital strikes or demo packs or something. Their main issue at the moment though is that Games Workshop just don't seem interested in balancing them with the rest of the factions out there in 40k. They basically got given some initial points cost and no help after that despite struggling. I wouldn't necessarily hold out any great hope they're going to receive any big help in any given balance update, but who knows, maybe Games Workshop might decide they're worth supporting. At least by the numbers at the bottom end of the win rate charts, they seem to be the ones that are struggling the most. There are a fair cluster of them around about the win rates of 45 to 47 sort of percent. Maybe not really that far behind the curve, but the average player struggling to win with them a little bit more than most. Dark Angels seem to be in that bracket, around about the 45 to 46% wins. I feel like this was kind of in line with my expectations of Wrath of the Rock. It's a cool detachment with some big raw power and some nice defense. With Raw Might and Deathwing Knights, it maybe just lends itself to a bit more strength in less competitive casual games as opposed to the top end of competitive play. It certainly doesn't seem that they seem to have all that many GT wins despite being a popular faction. They do have some strong units and some good rules though. I feel like maybe the most obvious way to add fun and strength will be to help out their cast of characters that aren't really taken alongside the Lion and Azrael, and maybe give some buffs to the Codex detachments. None of the rest really seem to compete with Wrath of the Rock and Gladius and Stormlance. Maybe Company of Hunters is doing okay for a small selection of people. Deathwatch also seem to be around about the 45% win rate. They have had 2 Grand Tournament wins, which isn't too bad for the few people playing them. With their big high investment kill teams, I feel like they're maybe not helped by playing into a meta with lots of Knights and Death Guard in them. Lots of profiles that can make a mess of fancy Space Marines quite quickly. For them, maybe helping out the slightly lesser played kill teams could be nice. The Fortis, Spectrus and Talon Strike ones are played less than the rest, though I guess they would have some new rules coming for the Deathwatch veterans in the not too distant future. The Tau Empire seem to have fallen off a bit after a strong start. It seems their tournament stats have them in a sort of around 45 to 46% win rate kind of area. Maybe a few more people managing to achieve some success with them at a Grand Tournament kind of level. They have got 5 Grand Tournament wins, which is fairly nice. Though at a more casual level, people are struggling even harder. Looks like Goonhammer have their more casual win rates for around about 43%. Seems like a strong faction rule wasn't quite enough to make them strong for the average player. I'm not sure whether Games Workshop would do too much to buff them though if they are still having some top event success. They may be in an awkward place where I'd say that a few points cuts wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But on the other hand, I suspect Tau players don't really want their units getting any cheaper as they're already at kind of rock bottom prices. There are quite a lot more factions at around about the 46 to 47% kind of level as well. I'm not going to focus on them too much in this video. They've certainly got some units that could do with helping those. I'd hope that maybe their overall strength might be helped out a bit if Games Workshop tones down the stuff right at the top with some more oppressive choices like Imperial Knights and Death Guard. Talking of which, let's talk about the top end of the 40k meta. The Death Guard have win rates for around about 56% and fairly similar casually. Maybe the standout thing for their statistics though is they've won something like 30 odd grand tournaments so far, which is pretty crazy. Massively better than any other faction and are also the most played army. Though even accounting for that, their tournament wins are absolutely hugely disproportionate. Death Guard just seem to have got incredibly lucky with their timings being able to survive this strong for this long. Their codex released a few weeks before the balance update, and it seemed it was too close for Games Workshop to even do points nudges for them at that point, which maybe was a little bit disappointing given how clearly strong they were even prior to the update coming out, and as a result it seems to have been them and the Knight codexes ruling the house at the moment, and they didn't get any sort of changes in the sort of follow-up balance pass, the one where we had some changes to Thousand Suns and World Eaters. At the moment, Death Guard just seem to have access to an enormous amount of incredibly efficient options, good detachments, and then some enormously powerful datasheets to go with them. My first instinct with them would probably be to mainly focus on points rises rather than toning down fun mechanics. Maybe the most obvious ones for that seem like Death Shroud Terminators with their 6-inch deep strikes with the Lord of Contagion. You could focus on either the unit or the character there. The Feated Bloat Drones with the heavy blight launchers are about some of the most efficient sort of gun tank equivalents in 40k. Plenty of their other demon engines are good though, perhaps particularly Mephitic Blight Haulers too. The big Flame Rain damage combo does cost a lot, but it does have some of the craziest damage output in the game. A full squad delivered out of a Rhino being able to shoot and charge is going to annihilate most things. And even if you address some of the major power combos, plenty of other things are really strong as well. The 5+ Feel No Pain Demon Prince, a lone Tallyman sitting around farming command points, Poxwalkers are good at infiltrators and provide the debuffs, Mortarian's nice enough too. I'd probably consider most of those as sort of second line after the first lot though. For rules changes, I kind of wonder if it might make sense to do something about the Contagions debuff from Mortarian's Hammer specifically. That's one of the very strongest Death Guard detachments. While it does support demon engines rather well, perhaps one of the main reasons it's a bit excessive is because it allows the Death Shroud Terminators to deep strike on any target super easily just by marking it for Contagions. Maybe changing the affliction thing to happen at the start of the shooting phase or something might not be the worst idea there. It feels fairly safe to assume that the Death Guard are going to feel the balance hammer rather hard. Hopefully they do so without removing too much of the fun factor and just cost things a bit more appropriately and make them sort of mid-tier rather than weak. Otherwise, we've got the Imperial and Chaos Knights. The Imperials have win rates for around about 59%, 17 event wins, again super high for an army that generally tends to be better at casual play than competitive, and they're the second most played army in tournaments currently. Imperial Knights were already one of the armies with the highest win rates out there, and then Games Workshop basically gave them enormous points cuts alongside their durability side grade, making the Titanic Knights ridiculously efficient, particularly Canis Rex. At the moment, the Knights are in limbo, waiting for their Codex, which seems to be delayed for an unknown reason, presumably something to do with either the book or the Knight Defender in some way. I kind of wonder if some of the points costs were aimed at that book, which might tone down some core rules for all we know at this point. Kind of hard to speculate though while it's not here. For balancing them in the meantime though, points costs seem perfectly reasonable to try and get them a bit more in line with the rest. I feel like their profiles are more or less what you'd expect. They don't have any mechanics that are just fundamentally broken. Just a lot of units need to pay a lot more for what they do, particularly Canis Rex, which probably didn't need to go down from his original 450 in the first place, let alone drop all the way down from 380 and become one of the most efficient units in the game. I'd say the majority of the Titanic Knights could do with going up a bit, obviously still aiming to keep them good, but just not quite this good. Maybe the other most notable standout might be the Knight Atropos, though certainly not that alone given how efficient most of the rest are. It feels like a fairly similar story for the Chaos Knights, except their changes happen when they have their Codex. Similar sort of win rates, loads of event wins, and super high for them given that they were a little bit lesser played compared with the Imperial Knights, though they're still the third most played army in competitive play right now. For their strong stuff, it generally tends to be mostly Titanic Knights, either played in Lords of Dread or Infernal Lance. Plenty of the War Dogs are very efficient though, maybe most stand out the Carnivore and perhaps the Stalker. Again, for these guys, points costs feel like they'll be able to get the Knights roughly where they need to be for the most part. Clearly feels like a fair few of the Titanic Knights could do with going up a bit, though I would say maybe not by crazy amounts. I just hope that Games Workshop managed to implement any fix without just kicking the Chaos Knights straight back to War Dog spam, which would be very depressing. It has been quite nice to have the Knight households with the big guys being the main focus. I do think that it could have been fairly easily done quite a while back though. For rules changes, maybe the things that stand out the most are those two detachments. Sticky objectives with OC5 is very difficult to deal with the Lords of Dread. Armies just might have a lot of trouble getting that kind of objective control onto mid-board points when they're trying to just deal with the huge shock and awe of those profiles marching up the board and dealing huge damage. For the Infernal Lance, perhaps the single biggest problem unit is the dual Gatling Cannon Despoiler, allowing that to get unrestricted lethal hits for a pretty small entry fee. Just seems like it was maybe a fairly bad idea. I'm not sure if it might make a bit more sense to maybe switch the detachment rule just to being sustained hits and not allow lethals. That way it would still be a good buff, but without making it a bit of an anti-everything weapon that destroys the very toughest stuff just as easily as it does lighter things. Otherwise, waiting in the wings, it does feel like there's a few armies that are probably waiting to do very well if the top three get nerfed significantly. At least on the numbers, Genestealer Cults and Adeptus Sororitas both seem to be doing great on the win rates. Genestealer Cult are up at 55, with Host of Ascension being all the way up at 66 at the moment in competitive play. Far less so for Goonhammer's casual dataset though, which does have more data. The lists are fairly similar, 53% wins. They're mainly using the Hallowed Martyrs to achieve that. There's lots of good success with the Champions of Faith as well. Maybe what's most striking for these factions are they've got an enormous amount of top tournament wins, 8 Grand Tournament victories for the Genestealers, 7 for the Sisters, and that's really notable just as they're fairly lesser played factions compared with the majority of 40k, the average player here having a much higher chance than normal to place super high. Thousand Sons certainly aren't so very far behind, their codex giving them a powerful Grand Coven, plenty of Grand Tournament wins and a good win rate in general, and then beyond that there's a lot of things around about the 50 to 51% sort of level. Demons, Blood Angels, Eldari, World Eaters, Drukari and Space Wolves. And the Tyranid Subterranean Assault is doing rather well as well if you take their stats alone. Close range deep strikes are a big pain to deal with, and I'm sure Tyranids will be doing far better in general if they don't have to deal with quite so many big tough knight profiles. I'd guess in the balance updates the vast majority of the changes and nerfs might fall on the big three, though I really wouldn't be too surprised if some of these guys take nerfs of one sort or another, though ideally not big ones. They feel far less ahead of the curve. Otherwise, for balanced Dataslate options, there's always the chance for some internal balance via detachments. Each balance pass Games Workshop seems to have a go at just sorting out at least a few of the ones that exist in current 40k, making them more tempting either by adding keywords, helping out key units, or maybe tweaking a core detachment rule or stratagem. They maybe don't tend to be super reliable in doing this for a bunch of detachments that have been overshadowed since release though. There's absolutely loads of them out there in Warhammer 40k, and I've just listed out a few examples amongst many. For a few highlights, maybe Dread Talons for the Chaos Space Marines would be nice. It'd be cool to see the Night Lords good, particularly given that the Chaos Marine detachments are really quite Legion themed. It would be nice to have a bit more balance in there. The Emperor's Children basically have coterie of the conceited, and most of the rest rarely plays. The Eldari Ghost of the Webway will be good to support the Harlequins, given that that's their main rule set these days. Spirit Conclave and the heavily nerfed Inari are probably both in the regions where they're major themes of the army that could do with some help. The Admech have some overshadowed ones with the Explorator and the Datasarm. For the Blood Angels, it'd be nice to have the Death Company one do well. That one was just obviously worse than Liberator when they released it. Maybe the Penitent Host for the Sisters, the Dark Angels Codex ones, and the Lion's Blade. And it will be nice to see some love for the Tyranids Unending Swarm, which has basically seen mainly nerfs. There are lots more than that, of course, including ones that are talked about already. Realistically, Games Workshop probably isn't going to help too many of these, though. As mentioned, it more seems like they usually tend to just help out the subset a bit. Otherwise, for some specific examples, aircraft and fortifications are a couple that are usually worth mentioning, but probably not much hope of Games Workshop actually deciding to balance them. I feel like there's more people who probably care about their various faction aircraft getting better as opposed to fortifications, though not really expect them to change very much about them. Currently the system is that aircraft that get somehow good get nerfed immediately, or the ones that are bad stay bad. They've got a fair few disadvantages just due to the class of models they are. Things like OC0 and locked flight paths for a bunch of them, but no reason they couldn't be good with the right points cost. The problem they've generally had in the past with them is that if one aircraft is worth taking, it's usually worth spamming them, but there are ways that they could address that, maybe having a scalar points cost where each subsequent one costs more, just having a hard cap of say one aircraft per list or something, or you can only spend this amount on aircraft per level of points that you're playing. Fortifications seem fairly similar. If anything, I feel like the average one of those tends to be worse than the aircraft. I don't think anyone really wants either of them to be super dominant in Warhammer 40k, as it generally tends to be fairly non-interactive if they are, but I feel like having them in the more sort of usable as opposed to flat out bad category maybe isn't the biggest ask in the world. For just a few other specifics, Fulgrim and Angron are both ones that a lot of people would like to see improve for their factions. The majority of the Primarchs are big interesting central datasheets that generally feel pretty good to put on the board, even if not all of them are auto-include. Angron and Fulgrim just very notably aren't though, both seen as pretty suboptimal versus taking other stuff in their armies right now. Points cost could certainly fix them. I feel like people quite liked Angron's rules prior to the update, even if he was a bit game warping. There's lots of different ways they could go about making these guys more exciting, just drop points or do something with rules in terms of damage, defense or other buffing things, but whatever they choose, having more argument to use them would be nice. In a similar sort of centerpiece role, I feel like multiple faction super heavies tend to be a popular request for getting better. Maybe things like the Guard Baneblade, Tau Storm Surge, Wraith Knight or Stomper. Again, most of these tend to be suboptimal for their factions, never mind any sort of table restrictions, not being able to march them up the board very well. Feels like most of them could use buffs of one sort or another to push them more towards usability. While we're on guard as well, maybe a special mention for their artillery. All the tracked versions certainly seem incredibly underpowered at the moment, and perhaps feels a shame for them as one of the mainstays of the faction being quite so niche with the infantry, tanks and artillery sort of setup they tend to have. Again, maybe one to be treated with caution though, and Games Workshop usually does with indirect fire, usually a fine line between indirect fire being usable and then oppressive, so they do often get charged at a premium. I feel like a lot of the tracked artillery variants just are really quite a long way from that though. Absolutely loads more examples, and you could go through each and every faction in the game. Maybe things like Tyranid Carnifexes and Screamer Killers would be nice to have as more central damage dealers they're supposed to be. Flawless Blades for the Emperor's Children are a fun new kit that just aren't quite as strong as some of the rest. I feel like Necron Warriors will be nicer to see a bit more viable outside a great big Orokin with big Resurrection combo. Space Wolf Grey Hunters are really quite costly for their battlefield role, maybe the most underwhelming thing out of the recent Space Wolf releases. It certainly seems for strong craft world lists, the Eldari tend to be running really quite similar things, lots of Phoenix Lords and Aspect Warriors, and often not much else. Probably a sign that they should try and even things up a bit between the Aspects versus everything else. Several factions do have a few wish list style things that are probably unlikely to happen. Emperor's Children players certainly wouldn't be too averse getting more digital data sheets added in, maybe access to Herald routes, and maybe some of the more standard Chaos Marine kits, Predators or Forge Fiends, but it seems they have decided which units they want in the book and which they don't. I've got no idea if they're thinking about adding in more releases to fill the gaps that are left by the things they left out. It seems possible, but probably not for a long time if so. I think World Eaters players will quite enjoy Khorne Berserkers going to Strength 5 base. Could just be one way to make them more interesting outside of Berserker Warband, even if they did have to have a points increase to balance it out. And one thing I saw suggested on a recent channel post were Chaos Spawn going back to OC1. The regular Chaos Space Marine ones were OC1 and then lost it, and then all the Deity Legion ones still kept it, so it will be handy enough to put them on an even playing field there. As ever with balanced things, loads of wishlist things for just about every faction. Hopefully they manage to do a good one, making the Death Guard and Knights still usable but a bit more middling, helping out some of the factions that are struggling the most, and trying to help out more units and playstyles become usable for all the stuff in the middle. Let me know your thoughts as to what you think needs to happen in the balanced data slate in any case. I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and takes down in the comments below. That's just about it for this one, though at the end of the video I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Titan's Terrain and talk a little bit more about their pop-up folding cardboard terrain system. As I talked about earlier in the video, I do feel like it's one of the terrain sets that's got more obvious advantages and disadvantages compared with some. The biggest selling point being that it's really easy to store and transport due to the whole folding and pop-up style thing, going in the same size box as a normal size board game. They're far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, though you could say that of plenty of other offerings. It's kind of similar sort of price to MDF, and of course it doesn't need any painting or assembly, it's ready to go immediately. The folding cardboard design does come with some compromises though. It does mean it's a bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF, given it is made of cardboard, designed to fold flat, so it maybe needs a bit more caretaking with it. The grid layout can mean a bit less flexibility than some terrain sets as well. In 10th edition 40k it can make some firing lanes, and I'll probably use just a tiny bit of extra terrain with an extra ruin wall or two on top of it, just to break up a firing lane or two. It doesn't really make tournament-approved layouts if that's what you're looking for, though I think it's a usable enough set for casual games. In any case, for their main offerings, they've got 3 different ones. A Forgotten Furnace set, which is sort of like a Chaos Foundry with a bunch of glowing ruins and factories. A Shattered Hive in maybe a more standard bombed-out ruined city with armoured containers and shells of buildings. And then some more verdant ruins in an overgrown capital, lots of grass and some ruins that could be usable enough for both fantasy or grimdark settings. Each of those also has an expansion centerpiece set, both a cathedral square type thing for 2 of them and an infernal spire for the foundry. Check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff, and in any case a massive thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, I'll just mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good or you'd just like to support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.